Are you feeling undercompensated? If so, stick around and I will tell you how to get paid what you're worth. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and today I want to talk to you about the concept of compensation. So if you feel like you're underpaid, you've come to the right place. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, from an HR perspective, how we determine compensation, and if you feel like you're underpaid, what you should do about it. And I'm a corporate recruiter and HR professional with over 20 years of experience working in some of the world's most well-known and well-respected companies. So I know a thing or two about how we establish pay ranges and whether or not companies pay correctly. So if this kind of content is of interest to you, make sure you hit the subscribe button. So in order to know if you're underpaid, I think the first thing we need to discuss is how companies determine compensation to begin with. So first, let's peel back the curtain on compensation and let's take a look at, from an HR perspective, how compensation ranges are determined. So in most major corporations, they are not determining wage ranges just out of the blue. They're not pulling them from thin air and deciding we think that you're worth this. Really, the first thing that we start with is we look at what is the local market paying for similar type of roles? And so what we do is we actually, in a lot of cases, there's actually these wage ranges that are wage surveys that will go out from industry groups that they'll survey an entire area, and sometimes they'll survey the entire country. But usually it's going to be pretty targeted to your local area, and companies will participate in it. So they may send one to our department, we'll fill it out and send it in, and all the different companies in our geographic region, or maybe our city or our region of the country, will fill it out. So we all use these compensation range survey data to basically determine whether or not we're going to be competitive with the market of where we're paying, based on the size of company, and a lot of different factors and industries and stuff like that play a part in it. So that would be the first thing that we do, is we take that data and then we look at it from what is our compensation philosophy. So each company really sits down and determines, do they want to be a pay lagger or a pay leader? And in some cases, some companies may decide to be a pay lagger, where they're going to be on the low end, and that's just their strategy. They expect them. Typically, you'd see a lot of turnover at these companies, but that's something that they just kind of build into their business model. And in some cases, there are companies that just pay a lot, and they want the best talent, and they know that keeping that talent is a better strategy for their particular business model. So the company, you really have to understand what kind of company you're working for. Are they a pay leader or are they a pay lagger? And there's a very defined decision that's made amongst senior leadership as to what kind of compensation philosophy they would have. Some companies might say, hey, we've got there's the market here is there's a lot of jobs and there's not a lot of labor, so we've got to pay a little bit more to attract the right people. In some cases, there might be a ton of labor and not a lot of good jobs, and then they can be a little bit more selective. Also, it's going to be determined by cost of living. So if you're living in New York City or the Bay Area, obviously there's a lot more. It's going to cost a lot more. So you're going to see a lot higher wage ranges, typically in higher cost of living areas. So you would see that as well. Now, we also look, so once we take the wage ranges that people are paying and we have a pay philosophy from a company perspective, then we look at internal equity. So then we look and say, okay, we're going to be a pay leader, and we know that internal equity means what other positions that are similar to the position that you're going into, what are we paying other people similar to you at similar levels, at similar job grades, at similar job titles. And so typically you wouldn't want to pay one person doing the same position $200,000 for the same role that somebody else might only be making $100,000 for. So we look at internal equity and we kind of equalize things. So that would be another reason. So they would take a look at, if you were coming into the organization, they would say, okay, this position, based on what other people are making in this organization at the similar level and what the market suggests we should be paying, that's going to basically create salary bands. So companies typically will have salary bands, and there'll be a low, a mid, and a high. There'll be basically 3 different points, and you'll be able to move in and out of that band. Most companies are trying to target getting people to the middle point of the band, and typically it'll incentivize you to move from the bottom to the middle pretty quickly through merit increases, or in some cases some larger companies might have a pay philosophy where they'll give you bonuses or whatever to get you to the midpoint. And then as you get past the midpoint and you head to the top end of the range, typically it slows down quite a bit, because they still want to be able to give employees a raise. So if you came in at the top end of your range, right? So say we gave you a range goes from $80,000 to $100,000 a year, and you came in at $99,000. Now you're probably not going to get much of a raise in the foreseeable future unless you move out of that band and into an enriched role. And so from a turnover perspective, I mean, if you come into a new organization and you spend the next 3 to 4 years there and you're never getting a merit increase, you know, generally speaking, you're not going to be too happy with that, even though you came in at the top end of their band. And so that's something to consider when you are applying for positions that are actually kind of below where you would target normally. So if you got laid off and you are just taking any job, and you find yourself in a lower level position than you used to be in, that's one of the dangers of that. And that's one of the reasons why companies kind of avoid people that are overqualified in that regard, because they know that it's going to be a merit issue, a merit increase issue. And in general, some industries are going to pay more than others. So when you look at, like for example, not-for-profit typically pays less than a for-profit organization. So almost every case, a for-profit organization is going to have a healthier compensation structure. Now, you know, there's a trade-off there. With a not-for-profit, there might be some altruistic reason why you would want to work there versus for a for-profit organization. But then that you have to really kind of put what's that price tag worth to me? So there's a trade-off there. Things like hospitality, retail, medical, the medical industry, those industries tend to pay lower than other industries. So industries that typically pay well, you know, like tech pays well. If you work for big internet or big tech, they're usually one of the highest paying. Manufacturing is going to pay high typically, and usually like engineering, oil and gas, some of the more kind of gritty ones and more technical oriented ones. You would typically find higher wage ranges there. Those are really the factors, you know, the industry, internal equity, pay strategy, and then what wage range, market wage ranges there are. So I think in order to understand if you're underpaid or overpaid, or I should say underpaid, we really need to look at that first. And that's kind of why or how companies determine their wage ranges. Now, it goes without saying, if you are interested in getting paid the most, you should focus on a career that pays well. So I mean, if you're going to go into an administrative type of position, don't expect to get paid what a computer engineer is going to be making, because they're two totally different things. So you want to ideally be choosing an industry and a career path that is going to allow you to hit the wage range that you want. So that's going to be the first thing. Secondly, you also should be targeting industries that are going to be competitive. So focusing on some of the ones that I just referred to, you know, you kind of extrapolate out. If you really feel like you want to pursue not-for-profit, you have to understand that you're not going to get paid the same amount. So, you know, if that's something that's really important to you, then there's going to be a trade-off in your career. So something to think about there. So if you are say you're an accountant and you're working for not-for-profit, you know, there is one thing that you can do is try to get into one of those industries, still being an accountant. If you don't want to change into being an engineer or something like that, try to get into an organization or an industry that is going to be a higher paying industry, if you can. Now, I wouldn't suggest pigeonholing yourself into something if the area that you're in just doesn't have a lot of that. Just know that if you ever get laid off or the company goes through a rough patch, you could be kind of pigeonholed into a certain type of industry, which might be harder for you to get out of. And I'll talk about that in another video. But that is a whole other kind of ball of wax, something to consider. But if you are interested in making the most amount of money in your career, doing what you're already trained to do, industry is going to play a big part in it. So try to pivot into an industry that's going to get you that higher wage range. So then the second thing that I would suggest really is know what the industry around you is paying, what the market is paying. Just like a company does, they go off and they look at local market wage ranges and they kind of collect data and they make educated decisions on what they want to pay. You can actually do the same thing as a job seeker. You can go on to sites like Glassdoor. You can go on to salary.com is another one. You can even go on to, some cases, there will be like LinkedIn and Indeed will maybe give you suggested job ranges. I would use those with a grain of salt though, because being a recruiter myself, I'm seeing what they suggest as wage ranges for companies that I know the positions that I'm recruiting, they're almost never correct and they're usually way off. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as a strong data point, but if you see kind of a ballpark, that's usually the average for that local zip code or area that you're in. You can kind of use that as an extra data point as well. The best thing to do, though, I think, is to go into Glassdoor, especially for large, well-established companies that have a lot of reviews. Check those out, and I would say don't look at total comp, but I would focus just on the base salary, because total comp could be a very drastically different from position to position, just depending on the individual circumstance of the person that were self-reported. But it is based on self-reporting, so if you get 50 people that are self-reporting as an accountant for XYZ company, they made this range, that's a pretty good data point, actually. So I would use that as a pretty decent estimate for what other companies. And so go around your local area, in the town that you live in or in the city that you live in, look at the major corporations that are in that area, and just get an idea of what they're paying. And you can kind of get a flavor. A big company versus a small company is going to be another thing. So when you look at large organizations, in fact, I had a video right before this one that talks about whether you should work for a large or a small corporation. That's something to think about. If you work for a small corporation, they are just not going to have as many resources behind them for a compensation strategy. So they have to get creative in other ways to attract talent and keep talent. And like it or not, those of us that are working in bigger companies, we kind of go in and poach from those little companies because we know we can outbid them. And that's just kind of how it is. So knowing that the big company is, in almost every case, is going to have a much healthier wage range, that's another thing to consider if you want to work for a big company. It's kind of a whole other thing. Check out that other video. I think I'll leave a link above for that one. That's kind of what I would do as far as how to figure out where you are comped at versus the market. Because if you think that you're underpaid, but the reality is that you're not, you want to make sure that if you're going to go and do something drastic, you need to make sure that you got some data to support your position. So if you just feel like you're worth more, but you don't have any data to back it up, this is the whole point of this video, is to kind of give you an educated data, not just get you all riled up and say, yeah, I'm underpaid and I'm going to get my torch out and I'm going to march on HR and I'm going to tell them that I need more money. In general, that's not generally a good strategy. So use this data and come up with some education on it before you go and make any drastic decisions. So maybe you find out that you're underpaid. If you are in the same company for a long period of time, you are probably going to get passed by in the open market. And if you check on my video, I think it's Why Steady Job is Bad for Your Career. If you look for that video, that'll explain this in a lot more detail. But essentially what I say in that video is that people who stay in the same job for a long period of time, so you're staying in a position for 8, 10, 12, 13, 14 years, you are going to inevitably be passed by the open market. And so I know it kind of sounds like, hey, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be rewarded by long tenure, but it actually comes back to bite you, and bite you pretty hard in your career if you have stayed at the same position, especially for a smaller company. If you came out of college and you started into a company and you worked there for a long period of time, inevitably the new people that I'm hiring after you, even 3, 4, 5 years later, are going to be coming in at the same or even higher wage range than you. And it just is what it is, because the market continues to shift. You want to make sure that you are making yourself as marketable as possible. And the best way to make yourself marketable is to come up or develop a skill that is unique and in demand. And I can't tell you what that skill might be for your industry, but it depends on really the type of role that you're in. But look at what are employers demanding. It could be, is it getting a Six Sigma black belt? I know that people who have black belts tend to have more opportunities than people that don't. If you are in a technical role, getting a certain type of programming language that maybe not everybody has, that's more niche, that's harder to get. Focus on those hard to get skills. If you're just doing what everybody else is doing, you're not differentiating yourself and you're not making yourself unique. And then inevitably, you're just going to be part of kind of the pack that moves through their career. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking for top dollar, you need to give yourself a marketable skill that is unique. Okay, you can't be doing what everybody else is doing and expect to be paid the most. Okay, so that's the other thing. And then if you really get to the point where you are frustrated with your situation, and you really realize that you've good performance, you have developed those skills, and you are to the point where you know that you're being underpaid, then you need to go into your HR department and say, hey, listen, based on this data set and then back it up with facts. So you have local market wage surveys, you have other opportunities that are potentially out there, you have your performance to back it up, and you have unique skill sets, and and ask for the raise. If you do that though, be prepared that they might say, okay, bye. And so you need to be prepared to have an updated resume, and you better be prepared to hit the ground running if you do that. So again, check out that 5-day bootcamp, because I actually talk about how to create a winning resume that's going to get noticed by recruiters, and will get you through the process as quickly as possible to land that best possible position. So if you go in trying to ask for a raise and your company's not receptive to it, you could potentially put yourself on the radar screen for not being satisfied. And honestly, that might not be a bad thing, because sometimes you need to be kind of pushed out of the nest. So the last thing that I would suggest is, if you've gone and done all these things and you really find yourself at an impasse, and you are not satisfied with where you are, and the market's passing you by because you've been there and you've been paying your dues, and maybe you've gotten passed by for promotion or whatever, you need to make a hard decision. And that's when your network comes into play. That's when administering all the tools that I talk about in my training courses, that's when all of that stuff really starts to become real important, and that's when you apply it. So there is a lot of information here. I know that this is probably, when you look at how do you get positioned to get the highest wage ranges for your job type, it does take some strategy. It's kind of like a chess game. Take careful planning and make proactive steps, but back up anything that you have with facts. Companies like to have data to support it. So if you come in loaded with data and your company's reasonable, they're going to look at it and say, hey, they actually have a point. We probably are underpaying, undercomping, and if you're a valuable contributor to the team, you may find yourself with a raise. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I usually do try to check them, and I will be happy to try to make a future video about some of the questions that you might have. Otherwise, appreciate you dropping by today. Make sure to hit the like button. It helps other people find the content that they're looking for, and we will see you on the next one.